Music is a key part of British life and British culture. Several important genres of music have their origins on the British Isles. So far, not a single one of Britain's musical artists have gained nearly as much fame, popularity, or notoriety as the Beatles, a rock band which existed from 1960 up until their breakup in 1970. The Beatles were founded by four men from the British city of Liverpool: John Lennon, Paul McCartney, George Harrison, and Richard Starkey, who prefers to be called Ringo Starr. Before they came along, John Lennon had already been a member of a small band he started called the Blackjacks. John founded the Blackjacks in 1956 and had some small local successes. However, he had the name quickly changed to the Quarrymen after he learned that somebody else was already using the name Blackjacks. In 1957, John's good friend Paul McCartney joined John as a guitarist. John's friend George Harrison watched him play in 1958 and auditioned to play for him as well. John was impressed by George's skills, but initially believed that George was too young to play with them, as George was only 15 at the time. After a month, however, John changed his mind and enlisted George. Stuart Sutcliffe joined them in 1960, and they changed their name to the Silver Beatles at Stuart's request. Although Stuart suggested they called themselves the Beatles, that's spelled B-E-A-T-A-L-S. However, they later simply shortened it to the Beatles. In 1960, they contacted Pete Best and hired him as a drummer. The Beatles went to Hamburg, Germany, where they gained some notable successes. However, Stuart left them shortly afterwards, and Pete was fired due to the poor quality of his drumming. Ringo Starr was hired to replace him as the band's drummer, and the Fab Four as we know them was born. Brian Epstein became their producer, and the next several years showed them nothing but the highest successes. In 1963, the Beatles released the Please Please Me album, which hit #1 on every single British chart except for Record Retailer, where it peaked at #2. The album contained 10 songs, with notable ones including Love Me Do, Twist and Shout, Please Please Me, and She Loves You. As the Beatles began to tour, they at first liked the sound of the crowds cheering and screaming because, in Paul's words, it meant they were successful. However, it quickly grew annoying to them. As the Beatles toured the United States for the first time, they began what is now known as the British Invasion, as British music became more popular in the United States. The first Beatles song played on US radio was I Want to Hold Your Hand, played on Washington, D.C. public radio for the first time in December 1963. After the Beatles played on the Ed Sullivan Show in Florida, there were no doubts on whether they'd be a success in the United States. In 1963, the Beatles starred in their first movie. A whole movie was made to promote the A Hard Day's Night album, simply titled A Hard Day's Night. It was very well received by both critics and fans alike. 1 year later, the Beatles discovered their first instance of American racial segregation when they were informed in Jacksonville, Florida, that their audience would be segregated by race. The Beatles were disgusted by the racism and refused to play unless the audience was desegregated. Worried they'd lose concert revenue, the city officials gave in to their demands. The Beatles also refused to stay at a hotel where white people were only allowed. When Paul McCartney asked why white people were segregated from everyone else, and why white people always got the better half of everything, he was told it was a, quote, political issue in the United States. To this day, Paul says he was not satisfied with that answer. Growing up in Britain, where racial prejudice is not near as much of an issue as it is in the US, the Beatles found American racism appalling and made it obvious that they opposed it at every corner. Their next albums were Beatles for Sale, Help, and Rubber Soul. By now, the Beatles were becoming more creative and their music style was beginning to evolve. They started out as a suit-wearing rock band with each member having a mop-top haircut. But now they were starting to dress differently and their music was becoming more deviated from the norm. However, John later claimed that the song Help was more or less a genuine cry for help, as he and the band were being greatly overworked and the pains of superstardom were starting to get to them. Nobody seemed to notice, though. In 1965, the Beatles were given their very own cartoon series. The cartoon was produced in their homeland of Great Britain, with some episodes outsourced to an Australian studio. Each episode of the cartoon revolved around a specific song, with the cartoon's plot matching the title of the song or certain lyrics in the song, although the cartoon's plot rarely ever matches what the song is actually about. At first, the Beatles disliked their cartoon. They saw it as a cheap cash grab that didn't really appreciate their art, and they didn't quite like how off the voices of the characters were, as in, they didn't quite match the real Beatles' voices. And to their credit, there was evidence to suggest it. The cartoon had such a low budget that they reused animation more often than Jay Ward cartoons. And there were so many animation mistakes, you'd think they'd outsource the animation to South Korea or something. Not to mention, the show only had 2 male voice actors, the American Paul Frees and the British Lance Percival. However, as time went on, the Beatles grew to like their cartoon. John is quoted as saying, "I still get a blast from watching those old Beatles cartoons on TV in the 1970s, and to the cartoon's credit, it was rather clever at times, and was often quite funny at the right moments." The cartoon ran until 1967, with reruns airing on ABC until 1969. However, the Beatles' popularity in the United States took a massive dent when John Lennon made a statement about how the band had become, quote, more popular than Jesus. While the British public gave no real reaction to the statement, conservative Christians in the United States were furious. Almost overnight, the southern US lit up with public destruction of Beatles albums and merchandise, and many southern US radio stations stopped playing Beatles songs. The entire US city of Minneapolis even banned the Beatles from stepping within the city limits by law. Ironically, the same people who did all of this are the exact same people who today claim that young people and leftists are too easily offended. John didn't really seem to care all that much at first, but as the other band members and a news reporter pressured him to apologize, he finally quoted, "If it'll make you happy, then okay, I'm sorry." This undoubtedly was not the most sincere apology ever said, especially considering the fact that just a few seconds before, John quoted, "If I had said television was more popular than Jesus, I might have gotten away with it." It's easy to see why most of the conservative Christians in the US were not satisfied with that apology. Despite the setback, however, the band continued to crank out hits. Their next album, Revolver, was sensational for its creativity. George Harrison plays an Indian sitar for several songs in the album. Some notable songs from the album include Got to Get You Into My Life, Taxman, and Eleanor Rigby. However, at this time, the Beatles stopped touring and became a studio-only band. Why? Because they felt it was damaging their ability to play music. And to their credit, they had evidence to suggest so. Everywhere they toured, their fans screamed so loud that they couldn't even hear themselves play. However, once they arrived in Japan for the first time, they encountered the first polite, quiet audience that they had seen in years. And now that they could hear themselves, they discovered they had been playing out of tune, and thus they decided it would be best if they just stopped touring. Then, possibly their most creative album, Sgt. Pepper's Lonely Hearts Club Band, was released. The Beatles tried on complete alter egos with new clothes and a new style. It was incredibly well received, with much of its music played at hippie festivals in the US and Canada. Their next album, Magical Mystery Tour, followed the same formula. By now, the Beatles were once again featured in a cartoon, but this time it was a movie. Yellow Submarine was released to British cinema, and it starred the Beatles as they saved Pepperland, a fictional place deep underneath the sea. Rather than being a cash grab, this was a much more ambitious creation, and the Beatles themselves immediately loved it, agreeing to appear as themselves in the end. However, around this time, John had fallen in love, and it was starting to get in the way of music production. He had recently had kids with a young Japanese woman named Yoko Ono, and their love life was getting in the way of music production. It also did not help that the other Beatles were not terribly fond of Yoko. Despite this, the band cranked out yet another hit album. The album cover and the name were shockingly simple. The album was simply called The Beatles, and the cover was nothing but a blank white sheet with The Beatles written in small stock text. The Beatles made this to make a sharp contrast to the incredibly colorful Sgt. Pepper and Magical Mystery Tour album covers. Due to its plain white cover, the album is often referred to as just the White Album. The White Album contains several unique songs, such as the political protest song Revolution and the creepy, strange-sounding Revolution 9, which, according to the band, was supposed to symbolize the political instability of the time period. Their next album was also a success. It was called Abbey Road, named after the studio in London where they recorded. The album cover showed them walking across the street in the road in front of their studio. Notable songs included Here Comes the Sun and Because. However, their next album, Let It Be, would unfortunately be their last. John's relationship with Yoko Ono had driven the rest of the band nuts. One of the last notable things the band did together was perform a free concert on a London rooftop, playing several songs from the Let It Be album. In May of 1970, the band officially broke up. However, once you're a musician, you're always a musician. After they broke up, each Beatle began their own successful solo careers. John Lennon became a staunch anti-war activist and moved to New York City, where he created the hit protest song Imagine. Paul McCartney created songs such as Wonderful Christmas Time. George Harrison created songs such as My Sweet Lord and I've Got My Mind Set on You, both of which were massive hits. Ringo Starr, however, likely has the most interesting solo career, as he continued making, quote, hippie songs like the Beatles had done with Sgt. Pepper. Despite them breaking up, deep down, the Beatles never stopped being friends and even showed that they still liked each other. John Lennon kept Paul McCartney's phone number safe with him, and they often shared a living room to watch TV together even after the breakup. In fact, in the mid-1970s, John was even seen wearing an I Love Paul button that you'd buy at a Beatles concert in the early 60s. When asked why, he simply responded, because I love Paul. However, in 1980, John was suddenly assassinated. Mark David Chapman, who was still angry about John's "we're more popular than Jesus" comment back in the 60s, shot him 4 times right outside the hotel he lived in. Mark was only a kid when John had made that comment, but apparently it had come back to haunt him. May I mention once again, these are the same people who say that young people and leftists are too easily offended. The remaining Beatles were immediately heartbroken, as was the entire nation of Great Britain. However, they then learned that John had left all of his musical equipment and all of his unfinished songs and work to his best friends in the world, the other Beatles. Paul knew precisely what John wanted. He convinced the remaining Beatles to come back together for one last session to finish John's remaining work. In 1995, Real Love, the last ever recorded Beatles song, was released. It is reported that the Beatles had to convince themselves that John was simply on vacation and left them his work to finish in order to prevent themselves from tearing up during recording, as simply knowing John was gone was enough to make each of them shed tears. In 2000, George Harrison died of lung cancer. All his life, he had been a very heavy smoker, and all of that tobacco had clearly caught up with him. As George had been a great man all his life, and may I add, a national hero of Britain, he was immediately mourned, just as John had been. However, as George was retired, there was no unfinished music of his to finish. Today, Paul McCartney and Ringo Starr are still alive and well. Although Paul announced his retirement from songmaking in 2022, Ringo remains active and continues his solo career to this day, with Paul and Ringo still great friends. Both Ringo and Paul have been knighted by the Queen of Britain as a reward for their contributions to British culture and music. However, the two men have had to fight legal battles for the ownership of much of their music against corporations like Apple Music. To this day, not a single British artist has sold as many albums as the Beatles. In the year 2000, they were the 7th best-selling artists in the world, which isn't half bad for a band that broke up so many years before the fact. Very few people would deny that their music changed the face of music altogether. However, this isn't to say that the Beatles themselves had no inspiration. For example, Paul McCartney was a tremendous fan of American artist Little Richard and even covered his song Long Tall Sally. It is, however, pretty clear to say that the Beatles were inspired by fewer people than they themselves inspired, and we'd have a very different world without them.